My name is Betty Morrison, and I'm 67 years old. What I'm about to share is a story of betrayal so deep it shattered everything I thought I knew about my family. But it's also a story about justice, delayed, but never denied. If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, if you've ever been cast aside by the very people who were supposed to love you the most, then you'll understand why this story must be told. Before we dive in, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel Vintage Revenge Stories. We're building a community of incredible women who know that our best chapters can happen at any age. Now, let's get back to the story. Before anything else, let me tell you where it all started to fall apart. It was October 2018, and I was working the morning shift at ShopRite in Astoria, Queens. At 67 years old, I was bagging groceries for people who could have been my neighbors back when I still lived in Connecticut, when I still had a house, when I still had a life. The supervisor, a kid in his 20s named Kevin, called me into the office during my lunch break. "Betty," he said, avoiding eye contact, "I'm gonna have to cut your hours. Management is reducing costs. From 20 hours a week down to 12. That meant $200 less a month, money I simply couldn't afford to lose. My one-bedroom apartment in Queens cost $1,200 a month, and that was considered cheap by New York standards." "Kevin," I said calmly, "I've been here 3 years, never been late, never missed a shift. Customers like me." He finally looked at me, and I saw pity in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Betty, I really am. But orders come from the top." I walked home that afternoon, my feet aching in the cheap Payless shoes I'd bought months earlier. The streets of Astoria were alive. Greek families spilling out of restaurants, young professionals heading home from Manhattan, kids laughing in small yards. I moved among them like a ghost, unseen, forgotten. My apartment was on the 3rd floor of an old brick building that had seen better days. No elevator, so I climbed the stairs slowly, clutching the rusty handrail. The place was small, but clean. I'd managed to keep a few pieces from my old life. The kitchen table where Richard and I had shared breakfast for 28 years. The armchair where he used to read the Wall Street Journal every morning. That night, I sat there staring at the bills spread across the coffee table. Rent, electricity, phone, groceries, blood pressure medication. Even with the reduced hours, I couldn't make the numbers work. At 67, I was drowning, slowly sinking into a debt I knew I'd never escape. 5 years earlier, my life had been completely different. Richard and I lived in a 4-bedroom colonial home in West Hartford, Connecticut. He was executive vice president at Blackstone Industries, a multinational corporation that started as a tiny consulting firm and grew into a multi-billion-dollar giant. We lived well, traveled twice a year, had a solid retirement fund. Richard handled all the finances. "Don't worry about money, sweetheart," he always said. "It's my job to take care of us." And he did. I'd worked as a secretary during the early years of our marriage, but when Charlotte was born in 1978, I became a full-time homemaker. Richard insisted it was for the best. He made enough to support the family. Charlotte was our only child, and we spoiled her rotten. Private piano lessons, private school, expensive summer camps, a graduation party that cost $15,000. When she got accepted into Columbia University, we paid the $40,000 annual tuition without blinking. She graduated with a degree in business in 2000 and landed a job at an investment firm in Manhattan. During her college years, She had become sophisticated, polished, perfectly at ease among New York's educated elite. She loved the city, loved her job, loved the life she was building. In 2015, at 37, she met Henry Blackstone at a charity gala. Henry was the son of James Blackstone, the CEO of the company where Richard worked. One of those coincidences that feels like fate, the daughter of the executive VP dating the boss's son. Richard was thrilled about the relationship. James Blackstone had been his mentor for over 20 years, ever since Blackstone Industries was just James Dawes, Richard Go, and 3 employees working out of a rented office in Queens. Richard spoke about James with deep admiration and loyalty. "James gave me my first real chance," he used to say. "When no one else believed in me, he did. I owe him everything." Charlotte and Henry married in June 2018, an extravagant ceremony at the Plaza Hotel that cost over $100,000. James Blackstone was the best man, and I remember watching him during the ceremony. This powerful man who had shaped so much of our lives, charismatic, charming, the kind of person who commanded attention the moment he walked into a room. 2 months later, Richard died. It was a massive heart attack on a Monday morning in August. He was getting ready for work, tying his tie in the bedroom mirror, when he simply collapsed. The paramedic said he probably died before he hit the floor. No pain, no suffering, just gone. The funeral was held at St. John's Episcopal Church in West Hartford. It felt like half the corporate world of Connecticut was there. James Blackstone gave a moving eulogy, speaking about Richard's loyalty, his work ethic, his dedication to family and company. He hugged me afterward, tears in his eyes, promising that Blackstone Industries would always take care of me. "Richard was my brother in every way but blood," he said. "Your family, Betty. Don't ever forget that." Charlotte was devastated by her father's death. They'd been close, and her grief was deep and genuine. But she was also planning her future with Henry, focused on what lay ahead. Her pain, as real as it was, didn't change her priorities. It was in the weeks that followed that my life truly began to unravel. Richard's attorney, a man named David Chen, someone James had recommended years earlier, guided me through the estate process. There were documents to sign, forms to file, legal matters I barely understood. I was still numb with grief, barely able to focus on the words on the page. "Just sign here, Mrs. Morrison," David would say over and over. "This transfers assets into your name. This closes out corporate accounts. This establishes the pension fund." I signed wherever he told me to sign, trusting that he had my best interests at heart. Why would I question him? James had recommended him, and James had promised to take care of me. But when the dust settled, when every document had been filed and every account closed, I learned the awful truth. Richard had died practically broke. The mortgage on the house was past due. The credit cards were maxed out. The company accounts I thought were investments were actually debts. The retirement fund that was supposed to sustain us through our golden years had been emptied months before his death, apparently to cover investment losses. The pension from Blackstone Industries I was supposed to receive was pitiful. Just $800 a month, barely enough to cover groceries. There was no life insurance, no secret savings, no safety net. Within 6 months, I lost everything. The house was foreclosed, the car repossessed, the furniture sold off to pay debts. I moved into the apartment in Queens with nothing but 2 suitcases of clothes and a handful of precious memories. Charlotte tried to help at first, She gave me $2,000 for the apartment deposit and bought me some basic groceries, but she was building her own life, and $2,000 was a drop in the ocean compared to what I needed. More than that, she was embarrassed, ashamed of my fall from the middle class to the working poor. When I started working at the supermarket, she stopped visiting. Our phone calls became rare, tense. She didn't want Henry or her new in-laws to know that her mother was bagging groceries to survive. "Mom," she said during one of our few phone conversations, "maybe don't mention your job when you're around Henry or the Blackstones. They wouldn't understand. They wouldn't understand that the widow of an executive vice president was scraping by on minimum wage. They wouldn't understand that the woman who once hosted elegant dinner parties was now counting pennies to buy milk." Gradually, Charlotte disappeared from my life completely. The calls stopped. The birthday cards stopped. She moved into a Manhattan penthouse with Henry and became part of a world where I had no place. For 3 years, I lived in that loneliness, in that poverty that crept deeper and deeper. I worked at the supermarket, came home to my empty apartment, watched TV until I fell asleep in Richard's armchair. Weekends were the worst, endless hours stretching ahead with no purpose, no family, no hope. Then, the reduction in hours at work threatened to push me over the financial edge. I was considering applying for public assistance, something I never imagined I'd need, when the invitation arrived. It was a cold Tuesday morning in March 2019. The envelope was thick, cream-colored paper that screamed expensive. My hands trembled as I opened it, not from age, but from the shock of receiving anything from Charlotte after months of silence. The invitation was embossed in gold lettering. "Charlotte and Henry Morrison Blackstone request the pleasure of your company as they celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary." But tucked behind it was a smaller note, handwritten in Charlotte's perfect script. "Mom, we need extra staff for the event. Pay is $200 for the night. Please confirm if you're available." I stared at those words until they blurred. My own daughter was hiring me as help for her anniversary party, not inviting me as her mother, but hiring me as staff to serve her guests. The humiliation burned through my chest like acid, but I needed the money. $200 meant groceries for 3 weeks, or the electric bill, or the medication I'd been rationing to make last longer. Was my pride worth more than my survival? The answer, as painful as it was no. I called the number on the invitation and spoke to a woman who introduced herself as the event coordinator. "Do you have catering experience?" she asked. "A little," I lied. "I've worked events before." "Excellent. The party is Saturday, June 15th, at the Blackstone family estate in the Hamptons. You'll need to arrive by 4 p.m. for setup. Black formal attire, comfortable shoes. Transportation is your responsibility." The Hamptons! Of course it would be in the Hamptons, where New York's elite spend their summers, where Charlotte had been photographed for society magazines, where I was once invited as family and now would return as hired help. The weeks crawled by as I prepared for the humiliation I'd agreed to. I bought a simple black dress from Goodwill and comfortable black shoes from Payless. I practiced carrying trays, balancing plates, moving silently through a crowd. If I was going to do this, I would do it well. The morning of Saturday, June 15th, dawned clear and warm. I took a subway from Queens to Manhattan, then a bus to Long Island, then finally a taxi I couldn't afford to the Blackstone estate. The meter ticked higher as we drove through tree-lined streets, past mansions that looked like hotels, past gardens that looked like parks. The Blackstone estate was stunning, even by Hampton standards. A 3-story gray stone mansion set on 5 acres of manicured gardens overlooking the Atlantic Ocean. An infinity pool, a tennis court, a separate entertainment pavilion bigger than my entire apartment. The taxi dropped me at the service entrance where other catering staff were gathering. I felt like an imposter, a 67-year-old woman pretending she belonged in this world of professional event staff. The catering manager, a stern woman named Mrs. Emma, gathered us in the kitchen for instructions. She glanced at my age with obvious doubt. "You'll be handling the outdoor terrace," she said curtly. "Champagne service during cocktail hour, then clearing tables during dinner. Stay invisible. Don't engage in conversations with guests unless absolutely necessary, and under no circumstances mention any personal connection to the family." That last rule cut deep, but I nodded and took my position. Guests began arriving at 6, a parade of luxury cars delivering New York's financial elite. I recognized some faces from business sections of newspapers, others from Charlotte's social media posts. They moved through the party with the easy confidence of people who never worry about money, never have to choose between groceries and medication, never have to accept work from their own children just to survive. Charlotte appeared around 7, so radiant in a designer gown that probably cost more than I made in 6 months. She looked straight through me as I offered her a glass of champagne, no flicker of recognition in her eyes. I was just another uniform, just another invisible servant in her perfect world. Henry stood beside her, playing the part of the devoted husband, though I caught him checking his phone constantly, his attention elsewhere. James Blackstone held court near the bar, regaling a circle of admirers with tales of business triumphs. His voice laced with that particular arrogance of a man who believes his own legend. I moved through the crowd like a ghost, refilling glasses, clearing empty plates, overhearing conversations about stock options, vacation homes, and charitable donations larger than most people's annual salaries. These people lived in a universe where money was never a concern, where dignity was never compromised, where mothers didn't have to serve drinks at their daughters' parties to pay rent. It was during cocktail hour, as I collected empty flutes from a side table, that I overheard a conversation that froze my blood. "The Morrison stock situation is finally resolved," James Blackstone was saying to a small circle of investors. "Richard's widow never knew about his shares, so the transfer was seamless. 25% of the company for practically nothing." My blood turned to ice. I ducked behind a marble column, my hands shaking so badly I almost spilled the tray of crystal glasses I was holding. "Brilliant move," another voice chimed in. "Richard Morrison was always too trusting. He never should have put those shares in his wife's name without telling her." "The beauty of it," James continued with a laugh, "is that she signed everything during probate. Grief makes people so pliable. She didn't even read the documents, just signed wherever her lawyer told her to sign. By the time she realized what she'd lost, the statute of limitations had run out. The world tilted beneath me. Richard's shares, 25% of Blackstone Industries, stolen from me through legal trickery while I was drowning in pain and confusion after his death. I staggered toward the kitchen, my mind spinning. 25% of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. That would be worth hundreds of millions. And all this time, while I was scraping together money for rent, James Blackstone had been profiting off shares that rightfully belonged to me. But I needed proof, someone who could confirm what I'd overheard, someone who understood the legal and financial implications. In the kitchen, trying to calm my ragged breathing, I noticed another waiter I hadn't seen before. He was older, maybe in his 70s, with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. "First time working one of these fancy parties?" he asked, his voice gentle and understanding. I nodded, afraid my voice would crack if I spoke. "Name's Tom," he said, extending a hand. "Been doing events like this for 20 years now, ever since I retired from my regular job. The money's good, even if the people can be—" He paused, searching diplomatically for the word. "Challenging," I offered. "Exactly." His smile was warm, genuine. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Everything okay?" Something about his manner, his quiet decency in this sea of wealth and arrogance, made me want to trust him. But before I could answer, Mrs. Emma appeared, barking at us to get back to work. Dinner service passed in a blur. I moved on autopilot, serving plates and clearing tables while my mind churned with what I'd heard. Richard's shares, my shares, stolen through legal manipulation while I was too broken to understand what I was signing. During a short break between courses, I found Tom on the service terrace, taking a moment to rest his feet. "Tom," I said softly, "can I ask you something? What did you do before you started working these events?" His expression grew serious. "I was a forensic accountant for 30 years, specialized in corporate fraud cases. Why do you ask?" My heart kicked into overdrive. If someone stole shares from a widow during probate, using legal documents she didn't understand, would there be any recourse? Tom's eyes sharpened. That would be securities fraud. Potentially criminal? Why are you asking? I glanced around to make sure we were alone. Then I told him everything. About Richard's death. About the documents I signed without understanding. About losing everything while James Blackstone got richer. Tom listened intently, asking sharp questions about dates, lawyers, and paperwork. "Betty," he said when I finished, "if what you're telling me is true, you're the rightful owner of a fortune, and there's no statute of limitations on securities fraud involving forged or misleading documents." "But I signed the papers," I protested. "My lawyer said—" "Who was your lawyer?" Tom cut in. "David Clay. He came recommended by James Blackstone himself." Tom's face darkened. "A lawyer recommended by the man who benefited from your signature. That's a conflict of interest so blatant it screams fraud." We were interrupted by Mrs. Emma calling us back to service, but Tom pressed a business card into my hand. "Call me tomorrow," he whispered. "We need to talk about this properly." The rest of the night crawled by like a nightmare. I served dessert to my own daughter, who still didn't recognize me. I cleared tables where guests joked about people like me, the invisible working poor. I listened to James Blackstone raise a glass to family values and hard work, knowing he had built his empire partly with money stolen from the widow of his dead friend. When the party finally ended at midnight, I helped clean in silence. Charlotte never spoke to me, never thanked me for my work. She handed an envelope with my pay to Mrs. Emma and disappeared into the mansion with her husband. I was just another temp worker, someone to be dismissed when the job was done. Tom offered to split a cab back to the city, And during that long drive down the dark highways of Long Island, he laid out what would happen next. First, we need copies of every document you signed after Richard's death, he said. Then we need Richard's original will and any corporate filings that establish his stake in Blackstone Industries. I have contacts who can help us navigate the legal system. Tom, I whispered, I can't afford lawyers. I can barely afford groceries. He turned to me in the dim cab light. Betty, if we can prove what I think we can prove, you'll never have to worry about money again. And there are lawyers who will take this case on contingency because the potential payout is enormous. Over the next 3 weeks, Tom worked tirelessly on my behalf. He tapped his professional network to pull corporate records, tracked down the original estate documents, and connected me with Sarah Walsh, a securities fraud attorney who specialized in cases like mine. What they uncovered was even worse than I imagined. Richard didn't just own 25% of Blackstone Industries. He had been James Blackstone's original partner, the man who provided the seed capital to launch the company in 1985. Over the years, as the company grew, Richard kept his stake while focusing on operations instead of ownership battles. When Richard died, his shares should have automatically passed to me as his sole heir, but the documents I signed during probate had been deliberately crafted to make me unknowingly waive my rights to those shares. David, the lawyer who was supposed to help me, was on James Blackstone's payroll. The evidence was overwhelming. Forged signatures on transfer documents, corporate filings with backdated timestamps, altered copies of Richard's will that stripped out any mention of his stake in Blackstone. It was a conspiracy that had been set in motion long before Richard's death, just waiting for the right moment to strike. On a Monday morning in May, Sarah Walsh filed our lawsuit. By Tuesday afternoon, it was front-page news in the Wall Street Journal. Billionaire CEO accused of stealing dead partner's shares, the headline blared. The article laid out the allegations and noted that, if proven, I wouldn't just be entitled to the current value of the stolen shares. I could claim 37 years of back dividends and accumulated profits. The financial analysts had a field day. 25% of Blackstone Industries was worth roughly $800 million. With accumulated dividends and interest, the total claim could exceed $1.5 billion. Charlotte called me for the first time in months, her voice shaking with rage. "Mom, what have you done?" she screamed into the phone. "Do you have any idea what this lawsuit is doing to Henry's family, to my marriage?" "I'm claiming what your father left me," I said evenly. "Money that was stolen from me while I was grieving his death. You're destroying everything I've built. Henry could lose his job. The family business could be ruined." "The family business was built with money stolen from your father's widow," I shot back. "From me, Charlotte, while you were ashamed of my poverty, while you hired me as staff at your birthday party, I was living in it because of money that legally belonged to me." The silence that followed stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. "You worked my birthday party," she whispered. "You hired me, Charlotte, your own mother. You looked right through me that night because I was just another servant in your perfect little world." I heard her start to cry then, the first real emotion she'd shown me in years. The legal battle dragged on for 8 months. James Blackstone brought in the most expensive lawyers money could buy, but the evidence was too damning to overcome. Corporate records, financial statements, testimony from former employees who had witnessed the scheme. All of it painted a picture of calculated fraud. The turning point came when David, the attorney who had helped steal my inheritance, agreed to testify against James Blackstone in exchange for immunity. He admitted everything: the forged documents, the backdated filings, the deliberate deception of a grieving widow. In January, James Blackstone agreed to settle rather than face criminal charges. I would receive $1.2 billion in damages, plus legal costs. Blackstone Industries would be restructured under independent oversight to prevent future fraud. But, as satisfying as the money was to claim, it wasn't the real victory. The real victory came with the phone call I received from Charlotte 2 days after the settlement was announced. "Mom," she said, and her voice was different, humbled in a way I hadn't heard since she was a child. "I owe you the biggest apology of my life. I was so wrong about everything." We met for lunch at a quiet restaurant in Manhattan. Charlotte looked older, more tired, but also more real than she had in years. "Henry and I are getting a divorce," she said without preamble. "The scandal destroyed his relationship with his father, and honestly, it opened my eyes to who I'd become. I was so obsessed with wealth and status that I forgot what really matters." She reached across the table and took my rough, work-worn hands in her manicured ones. "I'm ashamed of how I treated you, Mom. You were struggling, and instead of helping, I was embarrassed by you. I hired my own mother as staff because I was too proud to admit we were related." The tears I'd been holding back for years finally came. Not tears of grief, but of relief. My daughter was finally seeing clearly, finally understanding the cost of valuing money over family. "I want to make things right," Charlotte continued. "I want to rebuild our relationship if you'll let me. I want to be your daughter again, not just in name but in truth." It wasn't easy. Rebuilding trust after years of betrayal and neglect took time, patience, and countless hard conversations. But slowly, we found our way back to each other. I used the settlement money to establish the Richard Morrison Foundation, providing financial assistance to widows and widowers facing similar exploitation. I hired Tom Patterson as the foundation's director, his expertise ensuring that no grieving spouse would ever fall victim to the kind of fraud I endured. Charlotte left her Manhattan penthouse and moved into a modest apartment in Brooklyn. She started working for the foundation, using her business degree to help manage operations. She'd lost her taste for high society galas and designer clothes, discovering that helping others was far more rewarding than impressing them. James Blackstone never recovered from the scandal. He resigned from his company in disgrace, his reputation shattered. Henry tried to reconcile with his father, but the damage ran too deep. The empire built on stolen money collapsed once the truth came to light. As I sit here today, 3 years after the birthday party that changed everything, I often think about the chain of events that led to justice. If Charlotte hadn't needed extra catering staff, if I hadn't been desperate enough to take a job at my own daughter's party, if Tom Patterson hadn't been there to hear my story and recognize the fraud for what it was, James Blackstone might have gotten away with his theft forever. But sometimes the universe has a way of making sure the truth comes out, even if it takes decades. The betrayal I experienced was devastating, not just financially, but emotionally. To learn that people I trusted, people who attended my husband's funeral and offered condolences, were plotting to rob me even as they spoke words of comfort that cut deeper than poverty ever could. But betrayal, I've learned, can also be a teacher. It showed me who my real allies were, like Tom Patterson, who helped a stranger pursue justice simply because it was the right thing to do. It taught me the difference between wealth and worth, between money and integrity. Most importantly, it brought my daughter back to me. Sometimes we have to lose everything to understand what truly matters. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who need forgiveness the most, including ourselves. Charlotte and I have lunch together every Sunday now, usually at little neighborhood restaurants where the food is simple and the conversation is real. We talk about Richard, sharing memories she never knew and stories I'd never told. We talk about the future, about the foundation's work, about second chances and the grace of forgiveness. She's dating someone new now, a professor from Queens who drives a 10-year-old Honda and volunteers at homeless shelters on weekends. Sometimes she brings him to our Sunday lunches, and I can see in her eyes that she's finally learned the difference between a man's character and his bank account. The settlement money sits mostly untouched in investment accounts managed by ethical advisors who understand that this fortune was born from injustice and must be used responsibly. I live comfortably but modestly in a good Manhattan apartment, close enough to see Charlotte regularly, but independent enough to keep my dignity. Every morning when I wake up, I think of Richard and wonder what he'd make of all this. He trusted James Blackstone completely, never imagining his business partner would steal from his widow. But I believe he'd be proud that the truth finally came to light, proud that his name was vindicated and his legacy restored. The Richard Morrison Foundation has already helped more than 300 families, providing legal assistance, financial support, and advocacy for people facing the kind of exploitation I endured. Every case we take, every family we help, feels like a small victory against the forces that prey on grief and vulnerability. Tom Patterson often tells me my case was the most rewarding of his career, not because of the money, but because it proved that justice, however delayed, is still possible. He's in his mid-70s now, but shows no signs of slowing down, driven by a passion to protect the vulnerable from financial predators. Sarah Walsh, the attorney who represented me, has become both a friend and an advisor. She used the publicity from my case to build a practice focused on securities fraud and elder abuse, helping other victims fight powerful opponents. She says my willingness to stand up, even when the odds seemed impossible, inspired her other clients to persevere through their own battles. But maybe the most significant outcome of all this was the relationship I rebuilt with my daughter. Charlotte is a different person now, and so am I. We both learned that money can be stolen, but integrity cannot. Wealth can vanish, but love endures. Status can be stripped away, but character remains. She often apologizes for the years she wasted chasing status and wealth, for the time we lost because of her misplaced priorities. I tell her those years weren't wasted if they taught us what truly matters. Sometimes we have to walk through darkness to appreciate the light. The birthday party where I worked as hired staff feels like a lifetime ago now, though it's been less than 4 years. That night, I was invisible, dismissed, forgotten by my own daughter. Today, I am a force for justice, a protector of the vulnerable, and most importantly, a mother whose daughter has come home. The betrayal that nearly broke me ultimately saved me, saved both of us. James Blackstone thought he was stealing money from a helpless widow. Instead, he awakened a strength I didn't know I had and exposed a corruption that needed to see the light of day. Money, I've learned, is just a tool, Nothing more. It can build or destroy, help or harm, bring families together or tear them apart. The money James Blackstone stole was meant to provide security for Richard's widow and opportunities for his daughter. Used properly, it's doing exactly that. Just 37 years late. People sometimes ask me if I ever wonder what might have happened if Richard hadn't died, if we'd grown old together and he'd eventually told me about his Blackstone shares. I think about it sometimes, but not with regret. The path my life has taken, as painful as it's been, led me to a deeper understanding of strength, justice, and love. Richard's death was a tragedy I'll never fully recover from, but the theft of his legacy, the betrayal by those we trusted, and the long fight to reclaim what was rightfully mine, those experiences forged me into someone I'm proud of, someone who fights for justice, who values character over wealth, who understands that family is about love, not status. Charlotte and I often talk about the lessons we've learned, the price of putting material things ahead of relationships, the cost of judging people by their bank accounts instead of their hearts. We're still learning, still growing, still healing from the damage that years of misplaced priorities created. But we're doing it together now, mother and daughter once again, building something real on the foundation of hard-won wisdom and second chances. If there's one thing I want people to take away from my story, it's this. Never let anyone make you feel invisible or worthless because of your financial situation. Your worth is not measured by your bank balance, your zip code, or the clothes you wear. It's measured by your character, your kindness, and your willingness to stand up for what's right. And if you've been betrayed by people you trusted, if you've been stolen from, dismissed, or forgotten, don't give up. Justice may be delayed, but it's not always denied. Sometimes the universe conspires to set things right, to restore what was taken, to heal what was broken. Sometimes the very betrayal that seems like it will destroy us is what sets us free. This is my story. The story of a widow robbed of her inheritance who worked as hired help at her own daughter's birthday party. The story of a betrayal that cut deeper than any financial loss. The story of how money can corrupt even the closest relationships, but also how truth and justice can restore them. But above all, it's a story about the enduring power of a mother's love for her daughter, tested by years of distance and misunderstanding, but ultimately strong enough to overcome betrayal, pride, and the seductive poison of inherited wealth. We are more than our bank accounts. We are more than our mistakes. We are more than our worst moments.